ready when you are.
The international trading environment for red meat is likely to be influenced by the emission standards of the food we trade. This change is being driven by governments and by choosy consumers. If we get on the front foot, this represents an opportunity for our industry. Today I'm going to explore some of these issues as context for this session. I'm going to touch on the underlying motivation for reducing climate risk for the sector, then take a look at what's happening overseas, and then explore why these developments matter for our industry. To conclude, I'm going to set out some areas of focus for industry and government. So, to start with, looking at the motivation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Australia's climate's already changing. Temperatures have increased by about 1 degree since 1910, with the majority of that occurring since 1950. Rainfall across southern Australia has decreased, and the frequency of extreme heat events has also increased. All these have had an impact on farm profitability. If we just focus on the last 20 years, ABARES has found that the recent conditions have reduced average annual broadacre profits by about 20%. That is, a farm of today would be about 20% more profitable if it had operated in the climate of the past, which existed between 1950 and 1999. These effects were most pronounced for the cropping sector, with a reduction of about 36% per annum in annual profits. Beef farmers have also been affected, but by around 5%. On the positive side, however, farmers have been adapting, which is helping to offset some of the impacts of these changes. However, with further changes projected, the adaptation that's needed is likely to continue. Reducing the extent of this future adaptation is an important task and an important risk management strategy for the sector. And that depends on international action, with implications for the way that we produce and for the market conditions we are likely to face. So let's take a look at the global framework for action. You'd all be familiar with the Paris temperature goals, keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees and ideally at 1.5 degrees. That's a threshold to reduce the more significant risks of climate change. But what is perhaps less widely discussed is that the global emissions pathway to achieve these goals requires emissions to peak rapidly and then to decrease and falling to net zero in the second half of the century. Now, by net zero, I mean it's not for every sector. It's for the global economy as a whole. And what it means is that some sectors will continue to produce emissions, while others will provide offsets. Now, while this goal is a collective goal, the important element for trade is that each country is setting its own targets and own policies in how it will contribute. So, who is acting in this space? What you see here is a snapshot of countries that are planning their transition to net zero economies. Now, some of these have legislated targets, some have proposed legislation, and others have targets that are set in policy. No country is planning to cut its agricultural production. The aim is to reduce the level of emissions where possible through improvements that range from efficiency of production to dealing with the emissions intensity of the output. So, for example, if we take a look at the EU, which has a more detailed plan set out, we see that positive emissions will remain from agriculture into the future, offset by other sectors. But what you can see is that a reasonable number of countries, including some significant trade influences, are thinking about the transition to a substantially lower emissions future. And as they begin that transition, they will probably see the policies that they adopt flow through to trade arrangements with other nations, including Australia. Now, the signs from the early movers are already there. The EU has said that it plans to use FTAs to support the Paris goals. And as part of the FTA, it has assessed the emissions impact of a potential agreement with Australia. This assessment has highlighted increases in emissions that could arise from reaching an agreement and has specifically targeted the beef sector as a cause of those. Now, not that we would agree with their assessment in full, but the signs are there. They are also discussing this idea of border adjustments. And these are taxes based on the emissions profile of imports. The UK has also raised similar prospects. Now, border adjustments aim to avoid carbon leakage, and that's where production moves from a country which has stricter emission standards to one where there's less stringent standards. The practical effect of these border adjustments is that domestic emission standards get imposed on imported product. So these standards would make emissions intensity part of Australia's export competitiveness, just like trying to meet maximum residue limits or dealing with tariffs. Given this, Australian producers should have a strong interest in how these country-level policies develop. Now, only one facet of international competitiveness, there may, though, be opportunities for those who can compete on the basis of emissions intensity. So in that case, if action in international markets is going to matter for market access, it's useful to take a look at Australia's emissions profile and trends to see how it's changing. This gives us an indication of where might the challenges and opportunities lie. Looking at Australia's emissions profile, agriculture currently accounts for about 13% of total emissions, excluding those related to land use change. Most of that is associated with livestock production, with beef having the largest share, shown by the red. The remaining emissions come from crop residue burning, the use of fertiliser, lime and urea. When we take a look at how these things have changed over time, there are really two parts to the story. The first is that the sector does have a good news story to tell in relation to land use change. These emissions have significantly reduced over the period from 1990 to 2017, largely due to reduced land clearing. The sector has also contributed to Australia's carbon sink through voluntary actions to reduce emissions on individual farms and as part of market activities, including sales of credits to the Climate Solutions Fund and also to the secondary market. These are picked up in the green on the chart, but not all of these are associated with agriculture. However, while these are important for national emissions targets, it is unlikely that these historical reductions will be credited to exporters in emerging trade or market discussions. The more likely consideration, and now that's the second part of the story, are that the emissions involved in production, shown by the red. If we focus on that, we see a fairly flat trend. It is likely that this element of the emissions profile will be the most important going forward, given what has already been realised in the area of land use change. So if we focus on that, what has been going on with agriculture's emissions related to production? Between 1990 and 2017, emissions from agricultural production, so that red in the previous chart, have declined by about 9%. But the results within individual subsectors varied, and they have been influenced by climate events, but of real importance has been what's happened in relation to market and regulatory conditions. For sheep, the collapse of the Wool Price Reserve Scheme has reduced sheep numbers considerably, which peaked in 1990, and that has reduced the emissions from that sector. For dairy, high rates of industry support were eliminated in 2000, and that saw dairy herds decline as well. Outside of those events, emissions have generally increased, but overall, emissions remain closely linked to the level of production. So, as the focus on emissions intensity of traded goods builds, pressure will also build to break this connection. We want to be in a position to grow the sector to meet our new challenge, and also to meet the demands around emissions intensity. To remain competitive, the cost of doing so will be important. And so the cost of breaking the connection or having to offset it. But so will the extent of the work that's required. And this depends on where Australia sits relative to other countries. Looking at that, Australia sits close to the middle of the pack in terms of emissions. This data from FAO, best available, however caveats do apply, paints a picture of how we compare with major exporters and major importing countries. Both of these are important. Exporters, so we know where our competition sits, but importers, as they're the ones who are likely to influence trade rules. What I want to highlight here is that we sit above a number of likely standard setters, the EU in particular. We also are higher than one of our major export markets, that of China. If we look at who we compete with in those markets, we see that in the EU, we have a relatively small share of the total market and a wide range of competitors, including Brazil, Argentina, many of whom are more emissions intensive than we are. But in Asia, where our most important markets lie, we compete more against the US and sell into markets which are domestically lower in emissions intensity than we are. What this suggests is that reductions in the emissions intensity of production might be required to maintain market access across the board. With some work to be done, the cost of doing this will depend on how the rules are set and the options that producers have to lower their current emissions intensity related to the production activities. So in terms of the rules, it's worth looking at the context of red meat trade. The red meat international trading landscape is dominated by relatively few exporters, including Australia. This creates an opportunity to significantly influence the international discussion around the way we trade and emissions policies that should interact with the red meat industries. If we don't engage, there's a risk that importers will take their own initiative and set the standards on a country-by-country basis. Given our production systems, those standards may not suit. Beyond the international rules, we also should have in mind to how accreditation works and the cost of getting accredited. Would it be at the individual producer level, as we have now with the zero carbon under the Climate Active scheme, the old NCOS scheme? And Steve will tell us his experience about that later on today. Or would it be at the industry level, so as to capture our exports in entirety? Now, the other element to cost relates to the scope of actually reducing emissions intensity. There are options already available to producers and a number in the pipeline that could reduce emissions intensity and improve productivity. But as you see from this graphic, significant further research and investment is required to make these a reality, and that's shown by the size of the bubbles. Without that further investment and research, there are limited options that would significantly decouple emissions from production, and this would make offsets the main option. Now, while we're not alone in this challenge, we can't leave it to other countries given our extensive production systems, which are different to a number of other countries. So to sum up, the focus on emissions and trade rules is a real possibility. Remaining competitive in such a low emissions trading environment will likely require some action on emissions related to agricultural production itself. If we fail, there'll be competition from other products and changing consumer preferences to a lower impact diet that Mario will talk about, and also competition from other producers who can break that connection. What we suggest is that there is scope for work with a small number of exporters to ensure that any rules or standards that are developed related to emissions intensity suit our production systems. A greater focus on R&D programs also seems warranted, those that deal with emissions intensity. And this is in line with the government's announced focus on technology. And to make this happen, developing low-cost accreditation systems that extend to low and not just zero carbon will be needed. The good news is that the industry has recognised this and is taking steps already to address these challenges. And we'll hear from Doug from MLA on this shortly. Thank you for your time.